I wonder where my cat is. When you're diabetic with a cat named Milkshake. Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to be doing chapter 3, which is the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. I did film chapter 2, which is my personal story with DKA and my pre-diagnosis. However, I've been having trouble uploading it, so hopefully I'll be able to upload it soon. But if you're wondering why they're out of order or why both videos have been educational, it's simply because I'm trying to figure out how to edit it and get it online. Type 1 is when your body doesn't produce any insulin because the beta cells in your body are destroyed. If you want more information on that, I have a bunch of information on it in my first video, chapter 1, the basics. In type 2, the body still gets insulin, however, it doesn't get it properly. The body isn't able to properly distribute insulin because it has a resistance to insulin. This usually occurs because of diet, although genetics are a big factor in this. It happens because insulin is needed so frequently and in such large amounts that your body starts to become resistant to it. So when you have type 1 diabetes, your only option is insulin. Although having a healthier diet can help, the only way to treat it is with insulin. So you're completely insulin dependent. That means that you either have to take shots, use a pen, which is basically still just doing shots, or you can have a pump. Even then, you have to do shots once every 3 days. So no matter what, you're dealing with needles and you have to check your blood sugars regularly as well. People with type 2 diabetes have a few more options on treatment. Although some still use insulin, there are other ways such as pills, diet, and exercise that can help you regulate your blood sugars. It really just depends on what works for your body and how bad your type 2 diabetes is. People who have worse type 2 diabetes tend to have to go the insulin route, whereas people that are kind of in the beginning stages or have a lighter version of it are sometimes able to just eat right and exercise to control their blood sugars. When you see commercials on the television that talk about diabetes, it's always type 2. They will literally say in that little disclaimer at the end, not for people with type 1 diabetes, and it's because type 1s can only use insulin. I personally have never seen a commercial for anything related to type 1 diabetes, so pretty much all the commercials you see are type 2. They don't usually specify, they just say if you have diabetes, but in case you were wondering, pretty much all that stuff is type 2. This makes sense because type 2 diabetes makes up 90 to 95% of all diabetics, whereas type 1 is obviously 10 to 5%. Since type 2 is such a larger amount of people, it does get talked about a lot more often, which is why there's a lot less information on type 1, and why when people think of type 1, they often have misconceptions related to type 2 diabetes. With type 1 diabetes, the onset is rapid. It often happens within just a few weeks, and you have pretty much no warning. Type 1, there's nothing you can do to stop the diagnosis from happening, or nothing you can do to prevent having type 1 diabetes. This isn't the case with type 2. Type 2 tends to have a very slow onset, sometimes even years. People often do have some form of notice beforehand, such as, I'm sure you guys have heard the term pre-diabetic. This is when a doctor is basically telling a patient, you have a very high likelihood if you continue on this path to become diabetic. And usually the way to kind of reverse that and make sure that you don't become type 2 is through diet and exercise. One thing that I find really interesting and a huge misconception between type 1 and type 2 is that type 1 is genetic, whereas type 2 is not. Type 1 is genetic in the way that it has to do with the genes in your body. However, it is far less likely to run in families than type 2. People with type 2 diabetes actually have a much larger chance of it running in their family. And one example of this is that when concordance studies were done with twins, there was a 90% concordance rate in the twins for type 2, whereas there was only a 50% within twins for type 1. While type 1 does not necessarily get passed down as easily, there is still a association with it. In the future, if I have kids, they are more likely to have type 1 than the average person, but the chances are still pretty slim, whereas people with type 2, it does tend to run in the family pretty easily. Because type 1 diabetics are insulin dependent, they have a higher chance of having low blood sugar or going into hypoglycemia. This is because when you are being given insulin, if you give yourself too much insulin or if you're receiving too much insulin, your blood sugar will actually go low, and this is a very scary, very frightening thing that I'm planning on doing a video about. But people with type 2 diabetes tend to not have to use insulin as often. And if they do, I know that my grandpa personally, for a long time, he just did 1 insulin shot a day. So it's harder to get too much insulin through those methods. Another big thing is that while there is no cure for either type 1 or type 2 diabetes, you can go into remission with type 2. Type 1s, there's absolutely no remission. There is a thing called the honeymoon phase, and this is right after you get diagnosed. Within maybe the next year after you get diagnosed, there's a good chance that for a couple days up to a week, you can actually have your body start producing insulin again. And people kind of mistake this for, oh, like I obviously don't have diabetes, or I have type 2, or things like that, but it's just a honeymoon phase, and after that, the body will not produce any insulin pretty much ever again, and it is sadly a life sentence, a chronic problem. However, with type 2, you can, if you treat your body extremely well, and especially depending on where you are in the diagnosis, you can actually go into remission, and essentially, if you keep up a good, healthy lifestyle, there's a chance that you will have no symptoms of it for the rest of your life. Another big difference that a lot of people do know about is that type 1, you tend to get diagnosed early in life, whereas type 2 tends to be people who are a little bit older. This isn't always the case. Type 1 used to be called juvenile diabetes, although people now try to not use that term, simply because it can be diagnosed up to the age of 40, with a couple cases a little bit older than that. When people hear juvenile diabetes or type 1, they tend to think of kids who are under the age of 10. However, that is definitely not always the case. I should know I got diagnosed at 17, and I actually know that someone that got diagnosed at 25. Type 2 tends to be diagnosed later in life, in like your 30s, 40s, 50s, upward. A lot of cases of people with type 2 tend to be older people. However, in recent years, sadly, the population of children and young adults getting type 2 diabetes has increased in America. With type 1 diabetes, you aren't regulated to a very specific diet, although of course it is important to eat healthy, and eating healthier can help your numbers stay more regulated. Because it is your entire life, at least my doctors have told me that I'm allowed to pretty much eat what I want, obviously within the realm of like not going crazy. You can pretty much eat anything that anyone else would eat. You simply have to give yourself insulin. A lot of people don't know this, and I've had so many people with good intentions, of course with good intentions, say, oh, shouldn't you not drink that, or shouldn't you not eat that because you're diabetic? It has a lot of sugar in it, and things like that. And like I said, it can cause your numbers to go a little bit higher, but as long as you budget for it with insulin, you're usually safe. And given that it is the entire rest of your life and it's nothing you could have done, a lot of doctors encourage you to eat pretty much how you used to eat. This isn't so much the case with type 2. In type 2, they try and get you to eat healthier and to exercise more often, to change up your lifestyle to be healthier, simply because it can help with your diagnosis. It can help you go into remission or have less symptoms, or switch to a different, easier method of regulating your diabetes. One other major difference is that with type 1s, sadly, ketone acidosis is more common. This is diabetic ketone acidosis. It is a very, very, very serious illness that I go into in my chapter 2 video because that is how I got diagnosed. If you don't get treated, sadly, you are very likely to die. It is a horrible illness, and if it gets bad, it can really damage your health. This is not the case with type 2s. Although some do go into ketone acidosis, it is much harder to go into ketone acidosis than it is for type 1s. I don't know a whole bunch about this, but I assume it's because your body is still giving you some insulin, whereas with type 1s, you're getting no insulin. If your blood sugars are super, super high for a long amount of time, that's when you go into ketone acidosis. And it's really only when you're getting absolutely no insulin or hardly any insulin that you go into ketone acidosis. Another interesting difference between type 1 and type 2 that my mom actually found out for me was that while type 1 tends to be across the board, any ethnicity can get type 1, type 2 is actually more common in African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanics or Latinos, and Pacific Islanders. My mom found this on WNYC News, and it was reposted by JDRF, which is a major association for type 1 diabetes. So that's pretty much all the big differences between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. A little interesting way to remember which type is which is if you think type 1 is you get diagnosed first, and people who are type 1 tend to get diagnosed younger, whereas type 2, they get diagnosed older. A little way to think of it, I guess. If you stayed through and watched the video, that is honestly so nice of you to do, especially if you aren't diabetic and you don't know the differences or didn't know all of these differences before. It means a lot. It honestly means a lot for people to know the difference. When people do know the difference, it makes me extremely happy that I don't have to explain it to them. Of course, I'm not blaming anyone who doesn't know the difference, but it really does make a huge difference for people that are type 1s if you know some of the things that they are allowed to do or that they aren't allowed to do, or what makes us different from people who have type 2 diabetes. Another just like end note or fun fact, I guess, is that if you have type 1 diabetes, you cannot get type 2 diabetes. I got asked this once, and I guess the person just didn't really know what they were, but if you have type 1 and your body is not producing any insulin, it can't become insulin resistant. Just a kind of funny side note, I was actually in the hospital about 2 months ago, and while I was in the ER for a diabetic related problem, I was watching House Hunters, or maybe it was Fixer Upper, but all of the commercials were either super carb-loaded foods, which when you are in diabetic ketone acidosis, all you want is carb-loaded foods, and they don't let you eat anything carb-loaded while you're in DKA, or really eat anything at all. So you're just watching all these yummy foods and not able to eat any of it, but it's okay. But the other main one was that, like, every commercial that wasn't food related was about type 2 diabetes and like how to cure it. And my dad would just make jokes every time one came on the screen and be like, "Oh, Sonia, why don't you try that out?" Which, of course, he knows that I can't, like, none of those are gonna help me, but. Okay guys, that's all for today. Hopefully I will be able to get chapter 3 up soon. I hope that you guys learned something today. I hope that this was educational and interesting, and thank you for watching my video.